As mentioned in the 2025 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix review video, it's the end of an era. We're going to be doing away with the current cars and engines, and from 2026 there'll be new cars and engines. And it's going to open up a raft of speculation as to what's going to happen in terms of the pecking order. Who has it right? Who has it wrong? Will a new era of dominance come about? We just don't know. But I'm sure there'll be hundreds of videos made about it by people over the next 3 months or so. Even with testing, we're not going to know because it's not always clear who will come out on top. As mentioned in the last of the Silver McLaren's video, Magnussen was fastest in testing. But who won the season? It was a silver car. It just wasn't the one from Woking. But it's interesting either way. The rumours are Mercedes are the ones who have done their homework better than everybody else, and they've also found a more efficient way of deploying the electrical energy, which is now a 50-50 split in terms of the electrical and the turbo V6. Okay, it's not exactly what people wanted from the engines, but this did cause some discussion earlier on in the season. Christian Horner wanted something like ramp rates to come in to help the engine save a bit in a straight line. But Toto Wolff said that these ramp rates weren't needed, which has led to this thing of Red Bull and Ford not getting it right, but Mercedes have. But we're not going to know until March really, or maybe testing before that. But like I said, it brings to an end 12 seasons of the current regulations, at least in terms of the engines. The regulations that have been deemed the Hoover generation, even if the engineering behind them is insane. A regulation set where Lewis Hamilton, Nico Rosberg, Max Verstappen and Lando Norris all won titles, and Mercedes winning the most races out of anybody in that time, having their engines in the back of the factory cars and the McLarens that won the Constructors the last 2 years. So for this video, I thought I would go back to the beginning of the turbo hybrid era, much like I did with the last of the Silver McLaren's video, because in 2014 there was one car on the grid that was, well, a bit of a meme. In the 2012 season, Ferrari had come close to a Drivers' Championship, much like they had done in 2010, with Alonso missing out by the narrowest of margins. I think it was like 2 points or something like that, with Vettel being helped out by Michael Schumacher, who was in his final race, moving over for the Red Bull driver. And Schumacher didn't need to make a mistake to let the person that would become champion come through. But anyway, this would be the closest Ferrari would get for a while. They would have cracks at the title in 2018 and 2019 with Vettel, but on those occasions, Mercedes would emerge triumphant instead. In 2013, they still had a modicum of pace and were still competitive. Ferrari won 2 races in 2013 with Fernando Alonso, and Fernando would go on to finish second overall in that championship. Alonso would also be second on 5 occasions, third on 2 occasions, but for the rest of the season it was mostly 4ths down to 8ths. It seemed that when the car wanted to work it was pretty decent, but when it didn't, it didn't. You also have to take into account that at some point in the season the FIA changed the rules regarding the tyres, as there had been complaints that the tyres weren't up to standard. And Ferrari and Lotus were pretty easy on their tyres, but Red Bull and Mercedes were destroying them. And Red Bull, specifically Christian Horner, had been pretty vocal about the tyres until they were changed. The FIA would bring a couple of new specifications of tyres over the course of the season, and whatever they did with them seemed to benefit Red Bull the best. Vettel went on to win 9 in a row towards the end of the season, and took his 4th title. At the end of the 2013 season, the new regulations were going to come in. Ferrari and Red Bull had been battling through 2013, so would their engine development for 2014 suffer? Some would say yes, because in the 2014 season, both Ferrari and Red Bull were off the pace compared to the Mercedes cars. Ferrari's entry to the 2014 season was, well, it was a bit interesting. And they'd gone for a design that got everybody saying pretty much the same thing.
What the fuck is this?
But strangely for Ferrari, there was method to the madness. This iffy looking nose was made through science and engineering, rather than somebody thinking it looked good or somebody hit the wrong button on the 3D modelling software. The noses for the 2014 season were mandated to be lower than they had been in 2013. This was for safety purposes and for regulatory purposes in equal measure. Lower noses could produce less downforce because less air is being shoved under the car, and when it comes to safety, a higher nose can catch above a side pod in a T-bone accident and vault a car up and potentially into a driver's head. The design of this nose cone was essentially forming a Venturi tunnel, the very things that were seen under the side pods of the outgoing F1 cars and the cars of the late 70s and early 80s. As the air went under the nose, the air above the nose is at higher pressure than under it, and the whole thing adds up to produce more front-end downforce. Which is, when you think about it, a brilliant idea. While they are called Venturi tunnels, the scientific theory behind it is called the Bernoulli principle. As fluid goes into a condensed area, it accelerates and the pressure drops, which is how ground effect works, and what was going on with this front assembly. Which is why, when you look at it from certain angles, it looks weird as hell. The first part of the nose is quite flat, but then it moves upwards quite steeply to comply with the rulebook. This helps exploit the Bernoulli stuff. While not a true Venturi tunnel, it behaves in more or less the same way, with the downforce and compression being produced in that frontal area of the nose and the wing, all to try and reduce the amount of downforce loss that the FIA had imposed for the 2014 season. There are shots from Reddit of the two cars driving around at the pre-season test at Jerez with FlowViz paint on them, and you can actually see that this front wing assembly and the nose cone is actually working. So with this front nose and all this other stuff producing the downforce that they'd had taken away, if you follow me with all this, why were they still slow compared to Red Bull, let alone Mercedes? Ferrari had got their interpretations of how the new formula was going to go quite wrong by all accounts, and this is the most Ferrari thing to ever Ferrari really. Remember that Enzo quote, "Aerodynamics is for people that cannot build engines." Well, Ferrari, on this occasion, reckoned that aero would still be the way to go, not engine power, and they ended up sacrificing engine power for aerodynamic performance instead. Red Bull also went down this route to an extent, but their aero was a bit more efficient, even if the Renault engines of 2014 were a bit underpowered by all accounts, as we heard almost every week from Mr. Horner. Ferrari's answer to the regulations was to lay out the engine in such a way that the aerodynamics of the car were hampered as little as possible, and in doing so, there were certain things that got sacrificed. While Mercedes had come up with their Spitfire style setup, putting the turbocharger in such a place where the turbo lag was even less than it already was, and did some freaky stuff with intercooler positioning, Ferrari had gone with a smaller turbo, as well as smaller intercoolers, and I think a smaller oil tank as well that they put in the gearbox assembly. While the smaller turbo was good for reliability, there was more heat being generated, and this caused MGU-H issues. What was happening was, because the car had smaller turbos and everything else, Ferrari was having trouble recharging the batteries, and recharging to be able to use all 120 kilowatts of maximum available electric power for consecutive laps was proving borderline impossible. This also caused power delivery problems, and with the power delivery all over the place in terms of how much hybrid they could deliver, the car could be skittish in traction zones, because sometimes the power was available in full, and sometimes it was less, or not at all. Ferrari's aerodynamic setup had also made it very difficult to heat up harder compound tyres, and that just made the performance worse. Performance was such that at a few races, Raikkonen finished outside of the top 10 on more than one occasion. But with Mercedes running away with things and Red Bull and Williams fighting for best of the rest, it left Ferrari back with McLaren fighting for the next group of teams. Kimi would finish outside the points at Malaysia, Monaco, Germany, Suzuka and Austin. Now, to say that it was pace alone isn't quite fair, because at Malaysia he was clipped by Magnussen and got a puncture, at Japan that was the race running the Typhoon, and at Austin he was involved in a 3-car collision involving himself, Sotil Sauber and Checo's Force India. At Monaco there was another puncture picked up after being tagged by Chilton, and in Germany he finished 12th after qualifying 12th, but with a faster car he might have recovered into the points. Alonso meanwhile had a better time through the season. He started with a 4th place at Australia and followed it with another 4th place in Malaysia, but was then 9th in Bahrain with Kimi in 10th. Probably because Bahrain is a power circuit and the car was going to be left stranded in a straight line across those 3 straights. Fernando did get a podium at China, which was pretty good by all accounts since the Shanghai circuit has 2 quite long straights, but at the aero-sensitive Barcelona, the 2 Ferraris were 6th and 7th, which is about right really. But Monaco provided a very good 4th place for Fernando, and then the Ferrari seemed to hover around 5th and 6th as the teams went to Canada and then back to Europe, this being the run that went Montreal, Austria, Silverstone and then Hockenheim. Okay, Hockenheim and Silverstone have got power sections but are still quite aero dependent, but given the overall issues with the car, Alonso did quite well in this time period. At the Hungarian Grand Prix he got his best result of the season, which was 2nd behind Daniel Ricciardo's Red Bull. Both the aero cars doing quite well in that race, while the Mercedes struggled. But this Ferrari was still somewhat an enigma. It had handling issues for days, and it's become one of those cars where a lot of people seem to have got the wrong idea about it. Hear me out here. Now, you might have seen the footage of Alonso at Abu Dhabi breaking the laws of physics as he goes into the first of the 2 chicanes over the back end of the circuit, as was. He turns the car in, but the rear end is braking on him. But as he straightens the car out, the car then starts to understeer away from the apex. And this has been the go-to clip for people showing how bad the car was over the course of 2014. That the car was fully undrivable, and then the glazing of the driver begins because, oh my god, he's so good, give him a better car, he'd win every race, etc. It happens with pretty much every driver, this isn't specifically an Alonso thing. Now, I'd hate to ruin the magic and show you a picture of Rey Mysterio without his mask, or show you the bloke who does the voice and puppetry for Randy Feltface, but Alonso was doing that deliberately. Because other onboards from the 2014 season show things happening at a much lesser level. The car is, on average, if that's the best way of describing it, understeering more often than not, and any oversteer tends to come on corner exit, while there is some underbraking. That's either because of mechanical grip being at a premium, or that the engine mappings were all over the place. I saw a quick piece of a Driver 61 video on the same car, and it does seem to fit with the belief that people had back in 2014 that the car was dumping hybrid all in one go, and being really inconsistent with it. Now, you don't want to dump all the hybrid in one go, because it just doesn't make any sense. If you play Assetto Corsa and you drive the hybrid F1 cars from RSS, VRC, or even the official F1 cars like the F14T or SF70H, it'll have different deployment settings depending on what you want to do with the car. Balanced high, balanced low, hot lap, top speed, they all have different effects. It's a lot more simplified compared to what they do in real life, but it does the job. The hybrid will start deploying at a certain speed, because chucking it out while feathering the throttle for traction wastes battery, and you can spin the tyres up. So while people tend to say that the car did both at the same time, it does seem that the car had a tendency to understeer more than it oversteered, which is something that Alonso likes more than Raikkonen does. Raikkonen liked a pointy front end with the rear somewhat under control, while we've all seen the footage of Alonso in that 2005 Renault turning in with the front end not complying until quite late. And with the front end producing a lot of downforce through the Venturi nose, they had to do it by design. Otherwise, you end up with a Red Bull RB21. But Austria showed just how much Raikkonen struggled with that car. With the Ferrari being more downforcey than other cars, it should have been a little bit better than some of the more slippery ones out there, but with the altitude of the circuit, the power deficit would have shown itself more as the engine would have lost power, which would offset any drag if it was working properly. Kimi even shouted over the radio for the pit wall to unlock some more power, but it never came. Through turn 1, the car just wanted to wash out so wide so much, he might as well have been in a front wheel drive car. And with the lack of power, it might as well have been a Clio Cup or something. But this happened a couple more times over the course of the season. At Hockenheim, he was baking the front tyres with the car washing wide, and when he said quite angrily over the radio that they needed to stop him and change the tyres, the team was telling him no, because they needed another 4 laps to get him to the end on the strategy that they wanted to do. But Kimi was adamant he had to stop, because the front left was completely gone, and was making the already bad amount of turning that was there now non-existent. I also found an onboard of him qualifying at Spain. He locked up bigly into turn 1, but that was probably because of the Toro Rosso coming out of the pits and then deciding to stop quite close to the entrance of the corner. Or it could have been a Lotus, I don't know, the footage is pretty grainy. Through turn 3, he's following what I think is a McLaren to the tune of about a second, but his steering wheel is almost at 90 degrees to get the thing to bite on the front end. It's at that point he abandons the lap and then tries to cool everything down and recharge the battery so he can go again. On the next attempt, with a much clearer track, he's turning more than 90 degrees into turn 1, and then in turn 3 he is still turning a lot, but then lifts to get the car to bite, which then induces a little bit of oversteer that he has to correct, and washes out wide through the rest of turn 3. Through turn 4, there's multiple corrections, turning, opening, that once again sends the car offline, although the car did seem quite planted through turn 5. There's power oversteer through 6, lift off oversteer into 8 with understeer going through the actual corner, resulting in another lift, and then a lockup into 9, with a rear end slide on corner entry. He lights the tyres up on the exit of 9 before getting power oversteer through 11, oversteer on entry into 12, and then lights the tyres up again on the exit of that final chicane. The car is a massive handful, and the comments on the YouTube video that I watched suggest that Kimi's being sabotaged by Ferrari by having this undrivable car, while Alonso is seeming to do okay with it. It's just that Alonso likes things to be understeery, but even then, Alonso wasn't exactly challenging the Red Bulls or the Mercedes either. So you're probably thinking, oh, so what you're trying to say here, Aidan, is that they just simply cocked it up. Yes. Yes, I am. So Ferrari did 2 main things. Number one, as already mentioned, was chase aerodynamics instead of power, while Mercedes did the opposite and reaped the rewards. Red Bull got away with it because the Renault had a little bit more power and the aero was a lot more balanced because Adrian Newey, and the other thing was Ferrari anticipated the new engine regulations to produce failure after failure after failure in the early days of the new hybrids. So initially, they built a more conservative setup that valued reliability first and foremost. And actually, they kinda nailed it, because after the McLaren, the Ferrari was the most reliable car on the grid. The Ferrari retired only once all year from a mechanical issue, that being when Alonso's engine blew at Monza. Alonso did lose the electrics at Suzuka, but that was because of the rain. The rain got into the car, fried the electrics in the steering wheel, I believe it was, and that was him out. So that could have happened to anybody. The exact same thing happened to Jenson Button at Malaysia in 2009, and Jenson on that occasion was quite lucky that the race had been stopped. When Ferrari did eventually take the gloves off and crank the engine to what it could do with less of the restrictions, the car was actually pretty quick by all accounts. It went from being about a second a lap slower than Hamilton and Rosberg to being within about 3/10 of the two Mercedes. Alonso did manage to achieve a first place in a couple of free practice sessions through doing this, but it just seemed overall that the car was unbalanced. Twitchy on the brakes, sluggish in the corners, and then RNG on the way out depending on what the engine mappings wanted to do. The other thing to remember is that pretty much all the cars struggled with front-end grip through 2014, and watching some onboards from the first lap in China, the Ferrari was no less stable than its competitors. For 2015 though, they managed to get around some of the problems that the 2014 car had. They went for a more conventional layout with the oil tank moved to the front and moved some of the other components around to try and make it what it should be, and then moving everything else around to package it with the aerodynamics, and the whole car looked a lot less, well, weird compared to the 2014 car. The idea for 2015 was chasing more power, and the side pods were slightly larger to help with the cooling. But with more power, those bigger side pods got offset a bit. Well, the drag that came from them got offset a bit. The new nose provided better aero, as well as being a bit more pleasing on the eye, and some more rear aerodynamic grip was generated for some more stability. And it seemed to work. Ferrari doubled their points tally from 2014, and Vettel won 3 races with it. As Red Bull had been in 2014, Ferrari was the only team other than Mercedes to win races. But the F14T will be one of those Ferraris that they just got completely wrong, much like the 1980 car and those cars that were run in 1992 and 1993. They simply made the wrong call. Aero more than power. But they quickly realised their mistake and largely fixed it for the following season, and then Vettel was able to win 3 races for the team after Ferrari had their first winless season since 1993 the previous year. After how much Ferrari dropped the ball in 2025 with whatever they did to their previously half-decent car, what will they do for 2026? To, fiddle with the saying a bit, it's Ferrari. Anything can happen, and it usually does. And if they do cock it up as badly as they did in 2025, you might think they'll have 2 drivers on their hands that want to go elsewhere. One into retirement, one to a different team, but I guess we'll have to wait and see on that front, won't we? So then, the story of the Ferrari F14T, the car that seemingly understeered and oversteered at the same time, even if that's a bit of an urban myth. If this has been a fun look through the motorsport history books, then do give the video a like so I know a good job was done. And for more stuff like this from the channel, there is a subscription button that you can click, and if you pop that bell on as well, you should be notified of any future content. If YouTube wants to tell you about it. Massive thanks as ever go out to the rad lads over at Patreon who support me at a more personal level, and if you want to help with the picture purchasing piggy bank or help keep the lights on around here, there's a link to Patreon down in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and anything else you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks for one and done donations and memberships so you can do Patreon but without going to Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.